Good evening. Welcome. My name is Scott Burge, Mayor of the City of Scappoose, and I wanted to welcome you here tonight to our awards presentation and press conference with President Abraham Lincoln. But first, I wanted to introduce our state senator, Senator Betsy Johnson, who is going to present the award. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you all for coming tonight. I don't think anybody can argue that we are in such a corrosive election cycle. The unprecedented atmosphere of bad behavior, allegations of wrongdoing, mudslinging, name-calling. It's easy to see why the voters, or some voters, would just be tempted to sit this one out. However, tonight's award celebrates engaged citizens, voters who discharge their public responsibility. It is my distinct pleasure to recognize the Scappoose School District and invite Mr. Lewis and Mr. Groom to come up. On behalf of a community that values and practices civic engagement. So as they walk up, please join me in saluting the Scappoose area, and on behalf of them, the Scappoose School District. So, there is this beautiful award. And Joel, would you like them to turn and have pictures with the award? And
Yeah, actually, if you turn towards the camera that way.
oh, turn. All right, all of us. Okay, so this is all video.
There's cameras everywhere.
All right, and then are there any? Pete, you want to do a still? All right. Can you put the tall filter on so I don't?
I'm sorry, Betsy. I could have scrubbed.
Can you put the losing 10 or 20 pounds filter on?
Thank you very much. And best of luck to you as you head off to college. And thanks so much for being here tonight on behalf of the school district.
Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you.
So, just so you know, the award was based on voter participation in the primary. Each of the school districts in Columbia County were the competitive areas, and the Scappoose School District area, we had the largest turnout, so we had the best participation. So, we should be proud of ourselves. The next portion is going to be our press conference with President Abraham Lincoln. The setting is going to be April 1865, the end of the Civil War. It's going to be a presidential press conference. You will be the audience, or all the press corps. The president will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by questions as if a member of the press no questions after 1865. So the questions have to be relevant to 1865 because Mr. President would not know the answers to those questions. So, Joe? A former senator of Illinois, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you very much.
Please, it's the end of the day. I'm sure you're tired. Why don't you go take a seat? I'm very pleased to have so many members of the press here with us this evening. I know that a lot of you have complained that I never talk about myself. But you see, I've never wanted my personal history or my purely personal views to be an issue. However, I don't wish my reticence to itself become an issue, and so today, with the terrible national nightmare through which we have been struggling for 4 long years, nearly at an end, I'm going to break with precedent just a little bit and yammer about myself reluctantly. Well, I say that and I hardly know where to begin. Begin at the beginning, I reckon. I was born February 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. I grew up on small farms there and in southern Indiana, and then later as a young man in Illinois. My folks, my mom and pa, were strong anti-slavery people. I guess you could say I took that attitude in with the very air that I breathed. Now, I didn't care much for farm work. Well, I'll tell you the truth, I hated it. But I realized if I was going to do anything else in my life, well, I'd have to make something of myself. I wish I could stand up here in front of you and tell you I did it through long years of hard study in school, but the truth is I don't suppose I spent more than 1 year altogether in one classroom or another. Still, by the time I'd come of age, I had learned to read and to write, and to multiply too. Well, up to my threes anyway, that's as far as I got. And I decided I was going to take these modest skills after I'd tried a couple of other occupations, had a little store and did some surveying, and I decided maybe I should do something else. And I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. I didn't go to law school neither. I did what we call reading the law. That means you serve as kind of an apprentice in a law firm until you can join the bar and start your own practice. And long about these same years, I was in my 20s back then, I decided maybe I wanted to become a public figure. So I ran for the Illinois State Legislature. I gained 3 terms there. And by the middle 1840s, this political career was going well enough, in addition to the lawyering, which I did to put money on the table, bread on the table. The political career was going well enough that the Whig Party, of which I was a member, agreed that it was my turn to run for Congress. You see, we had kind of a safe seat there in Illinois, and some of us members of the party, we'd agreed among ourselves we'd take turns serving a single term back in Washington. So in 1846, it was my turn. I went back the following year after I got elected in 46 and became a member of the United States House of Representatives. Now, you might ask, well, what did you do there? I opposed the war with Mexico. I thought it was wrong. Big country, picking on a small one. And I made some speeches, but I didn't make the mark I hoped that I would. The only piece of legislation I even thought of throwing into the hopper was one to outlaw the slave trade, at least in our nation's capital. But I found that I lacked the support and maybe the resolve even for that. So at the end of my 2-year term, I left Washington, leaving our nation's capital, well, pretty much unchanged by my brief tenure there. Went home to Springfield, Illinois, my law practice, which I found were pretty much unchanged by my absence. If anybody asked, I told them I was through with politics. Politics were through with me. Either way, I reckoned that political career was over. I went back in the courtroom, me and my partner, Billy Herndon. And we did well. I had a house built for my wife Mary and our boys. But you know, over the next few years, this problem of slavery, which had plagued our nation ever since its founding, began to turn into a crisis. When the Supreme Court of the United States declared that no black man had any right, that any white man had to respect in a court of law, and they intimated that perhaps no state could constitutionally outlaw slavery. Well, I began to think maybe there was something more important than patent law, railway rights of way. So after nearly 10 years out of office, I jumped back into politics with both feet. Now, I filed for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas. Now, Douglas, our senior senator, he had helped to dismantle the Missouri Compromise, a series of measures taken to limit the growth of slavery, keep this union together. And by his actions, let's say I had a bone to pick with him. So he and we traveled to state laying our case out before the people of Illinois in a series of debates that, they went something like this. Well, yes, it's taken a lot to get this old war horse out of the stall, ladies and gentlemen. Seeking office, senator in the national government in Washington. But I never thought that I'd be seeking. Then we got to talk about something that I had hoped would never again be an issue. much less in this year of 1858. Now, slavery is an evil, but we are not responsible for it here in the state of Illinois. We long ago banned slavery, and neither the Congress nor the President has any authority under the Constitution to interfere with slavery in those states where it exists. But now the extension of slavery into those territories not yet even organized, to say that's something else again. I don't know. Now, my opponent, he says that all this about slavery extension, well, that's just a minor matter, he says. A minor matter? I ask you I ask you, sir, how many legs would a sheep have if you called a tail a leg? Can you tell me? No, somebody? 5. No, just 4. Because you see, calling the tail a leg don't make it so. Calling this a minor matter don't make it so neither. That's my point. I read a lot from slave owners these days. They say slavery is beneficial to the slave. Well, maybe I've been looking at things all wrong. Maybe we should start slavery over again right here in Illinois. I know how we'll start it. We'll start with volunteers. Who here would like to be a slave? Well, I've been asking that question for weeks, and it's been probably mighty slim pickings. All right, we'll start it another way. We'll start it with those who would enslave others. If they want to tell us how beneficial slavery is to the slave, well, let's try it out on them, see how they like it. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a slave owner. Now, I know my opponent says that I'm being two-faced on this issue, but I ask you now, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that if I had 2 faces, I'd be wearing this one? Listen to our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, how can a slave consent to the government over him? What we need to do is to re-adopt the Declaration of Independence and those practices and policies that harmonize with it. And you know what will happen if we do it? Both North and South, if all Americans join in this great and good work? Well, we will not only have saved this union, but we shall have so saved it as to make it and keep it forever worthy of the Savior. Well, as I reckon you know, I lost that election. Felt like the boy had stubbed his toe, you know. It hurt too much to laugh, but I was too old to cry. I fell into quite a melancholy. I even asked my partner, Billy Herndon, I said, Billy, why don't you take my folding knife away from me lest I do something foolish with it. But you know, what I saw is the end of my public career. Others saw as the beginning. Folks started coming to me, telling me I had gained national attention, even when I lost to Stephen Douglas. They told me I could have the 1860 Republican presidential nomination because, they said, I was the one man who could stop the growth of slavery and keep this union together. Well, I can't very well stand up here in front of you and tell you I'm not an ambitious man, can I? No one knows until that presidential grub starts gnawing at him just how deep it'll get until he's tried it. Well, I won the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. They held a nominating convention in my home state that year, and that helped. With the United Party behind me, and our opponents split up into factions just as our nation was threatening to split up. I won the election in November, but within days of that election, Southern legislators began to vote illegally, unconstitutionally, for secession, forming the the so-called Confederate States of America. For the first couple of weeks of this administration, we worked night and day trying to resolve this crisis without bloodshed. But when rebel troops in South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor and forcing its surrender, well, the war came. You remember that. Some folks acted like they'd been looking forward to it. It was all going to be over quick and easy, they said. Nobody really heard a picture book war. Well, the only thing that happened quickly and easily is that the story of this rebellion became a chronicle of political wrangling and military setback. I put a fellow named McClellan in charge of the army, and he would not move for months, despite my urging. When he finally got going, he got his army close enough to the rebel capital, Richmond, Virginia, that they could hear the church bells ringing on Sunday morning. Then the fighting started, and our boys did well, but McClellan, he retreated after every victory that he gained. That was back when every member of my cabinet thought he could do this job better than I was doing it. Half the members of Congress scoffed at me. But here was my dilemma. I could not gain the full support of the considerable number of abolitionists in the Congress who controlled the balance of power unless I were to free the slaves. But even if I had had the constitutional authority to end slavery, which I did not, I couldn't free anybody unless we won this war. And for the first year and a half or so of this conflict, if I had made any move to end slavery, the forced slaveholding the states sustained with the war, well, they'd have quit and joined the other side, and we'd have lost this war. That was back when I was telling anybody who'd listen, I hope to have God on my side throughout this conflict, but I've got to have Kentucky. Well, we were certainly in no great danger of winning the war back then. Every month, thousands of our boys were dying behind men who called themselves generals, men I had appointed. And here I was, a fellow who could hardly stand to wring the neck of a chicken for Sunday dinner in charge of this slaughter. And just well, I thought it couldn't get any worse in the personal way it did. My son, Willie, 10 years old, he developed a fever in the White House. And my wife and I, we stayed up with him every night. But he died. And forgive me. I received a letter from Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist himself, a former slave, and he wrote to me, "You fight this war with only one hand, Mr. Lincoln. The Negro is the key to the situation, the pivot on which the whole rebellion turns. Teach the rebels and traitors that the price they are to pay for their attempt to abolish this government must be the abolition of slavery." Well, I knew he was right. I decided at the time had come. Now, as I say, I had no constitutional authority to end slavery, but I believed strongly that as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, I did have the authority to deny rebels any resource that furthered their ability to oppose this people's government. So in 1862, September of that year, I issued a proclamation of emancipation, not ending slavery, but freeing those slaves who resided in areas controlled by the rebels. Now, that's all I could do, and I did it. Some folks say I'm a slow walker. That may be, but I don't have to walk back. Yeah, the howling started right away. Some folks said they didn't care what was in the Constitution. I should have freed all the slaves. Others said I had exceeded my authority, even with this modest measure. They called me a tyrant, a dictator. The press weighed in. I hope I won't be stepping on anybody's toes if I read a couple of selections, but tell you what, if you'll forgive me for reading it, I'll forgive you for writing it. How's that? Baltimore Sun. This president and his administration are now adrift on a current of radical fanaticism. New York Herald. Here. The cowardly tyrant who now disgraces the chair of Washington and Jefferson could any day have peace and restoration of the Union, and he would have, only he insists on continuing this war, merely to free the slaves. But there was this from a soldier of the Union armies. It is no longer the Union as it was that is to be reestablished, but the Union as it should be, washed clean of its original sin. We are no longer merely the soldiers of a political controversy. We are now the missionaries of a great work of redemption. We have searched for greater meaning in this terrible war. And we found that while we thought we were doing one thing, we were in fact doing something else. That's when I began to realize what I'd known all along. That what had begun as a conflict over union had become a revolution over men's souls. From that day on, this was altogether a new war. And yet it seemed like nothing had changed. Especially here in the East, where so much attention is focused, our armies knew nothing but defeat. I finally fired McClellan and told him he had the slows. It was late in 1862, and replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside, who proved to be a disaster. Just months after I appointed him, early in 1863, I relieved him of command and put in General Joseph Hooker. And fighting Joe Hooker, he was just a disaster of another kind. And just months after that, in the summer of 1863, I had to relieve him of command and replace him with General George Meade. And now General Lee, he took his rebel army across the Potomac into the north and he disappeared. Anybody who was here in Washington back then remembers the pressure in this city so heavy you could hardly breathe. But you know, our soldiers, our boys, they had a new spirit now. They didn't care who was general anymore. They knew that a defeat at this point would mean the end of the war and of our Union. And defended now their homes and their families. They were determined that this should not happen. You know, the two armies finally stumbled into each other just across the Pennsylvania state line in a little town called Gettysburg. And there they fought for 3 days with this Union hanging by a thread every moment of it. Until finally, on the last day of that fight, for the first time in this war, our boys sent the main attacking force of General Lee's army running from the field. But the cost, 8,000 men dead in 3 days. A cemetery was laid out in the hills above Gettysburg, with the boys north and south laid to rest side by side. And in the fall of that year, November of 1863, a great dedication to that cemetery was planned. The finest orator of our day, Edward Everett, he was called upon to describe the battle and express the solemn pride of the nation. As a kind of afterthought, they invited me to come up from Washington and how to put it, deliver a few appropriate remarks. You know, they were hoping I wouldn't come as I've not been popular. But I told them yes, for I had something to say. After Edward Everett had spoken for over 2 hours, I stood up. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in larger sense, we cannot dedicate. cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us that live in, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who have fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be so dedicated to the great task remaining before us that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. You know, I dream often that I am on a ship which is broken loose from its moorings, a ship of which I am the captain, but I cannot steer it. It seems that in any great contest, both sides claim to be acting in accordance with God's will. God can't be both for and against the same thing at the same time, can he? God wills the struggle. And he wills that it not end yet. By his mere quiet power, he could have saved or destroyed this union without a human contest. But the contest began, and having begun, continues to achieve some great purpose that we do not fully understand. Well, as the fall of 1863 turned into the winter and then the spring of 1864, that great victory at Gettysburg began to seem like nothing more than a glimmer of light in a world of gloom. My friends, not to mention my enemies, they told me I couldn't be reelected in the fall of 64. I agreed with that assessment. I figured when election day came around, the people of this country were going to send me packing back to Springfield, Illinois, where I could once again take up the practice of law. But just last summer, as you recall, late in the summer of 1864, the fortunes of our armies on the field of battle took a tremendous turn for the better. And for the first time, people thought, well, maybe they could see an end to this war coming. So when election day rolled around, they decided they wanted me to stay. And I figured, well, if that's what they want, I reckon I better do it. One newspaper put it, anybody here from Harper's Weekly? Yeah, Harper's Weekly put it, long Abraham Lincoln, a little longer. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, as you know, I put together some remarks for the ceremony, my second inauguration, you know. No, I think people expected me to hit a note of triumph in that speech, to say we were about to win this war because we were right. And God was, after all, on our side. No question of whether we were on God's side. Note of triumph, I think that's what people expected. But I gave them this speech instead. At my first appearance to take the oath of the presidential office 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All deprecated it. All sought to avert it. But one side would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other side would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest, and all knew this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Both sides read the same Bible. They pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. The prayers of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, says the Bible. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall decide that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always attribute to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And yet, if God wills it to continue, until all of the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, we have seen dramatic events in the last few days, with the surrender of General Lee's army in Virginia on Sunday and the surrender of General Johnston's army in North Carolina expected hourly. This war is essentially over. This country is something new now, something it could not have been before. Maybe we have finally washed away something of our original sin, and we can stand newborn and redeemed. And maybe because of that new birth, God will find a way to forgive us. Well, I said I didn't want to yammer on too long, and I've been yapping for I don't know how long now. You'll have to forgive me. I know that your readers are waiting for news from the front with the end of the war coming so quickly, we hope. And with your readers in mind, I'll take your questions. Who has a question for the President? Yes, sir.
When did you first become aware of slavery?
I'm not sure I have a specific memory. I know my mom and my pa were always dead set against it. My first vivid introduction to slavery was when a friend of mine and I, we took a load down the Mississippi on a raft. It was a great adventure, but I got to New Orleans, and I saw there the slave auctions. Men, women, and children being roped together like so many horses and sold as chattel. Few things in my life have depressed me so much as the sight of the slave markets in New Orleans. Yes, sir.
If the Declaration of Independence said that all men should be treated equally, then why'd they still have slavery?
Well, that's a great contradiction, son. That's a great contradiction. Even at the time, they knew that there was an inconsistency. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence, was himself a slave owner. And he knew what that was doing to him. He talked in very stark terms of how slavery degrades not only the slave, but the slave owner. You've got something very important there. And the answer isn't a very good one. It was a great contradiction. Some say the original sin of this country. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Who was the northern general that was sent into the Shenandoah Valley?
Well, now we took and retook the Shenandoah Valley I don't know how many times during the course of the war. Probably the most notorious were the several generals sent out to somehow capture or destroy Stonewall Jackson's army, and it was like swatting at flies with a shovel. He always got away. They moved too slowly, and none of those generals very well brought glory on themselves. Then right towards the end of the war, General Phil Sheridan led cavalry and infantry up the Shenandoah Valley, up the valley, and Shenandoah means from north to south. And that had been the breadbasket of the South, and it was a total war by now. And destroyed many crops there, did what was militarily necessary to win the war. Yes, sir.
How did you become aware of General Grant?
General Grant, I think I became first aware of him when he took Forts Henry and Donaldson in early 1862. These were campaigns, a very quick and decisive maneuver. And he asked for unconditional surrender immediately as their position became untenable. And it was said that his initials, U.S., stood for unconditional surrender. We next heard about him a couple months later, unfortunately in the spring of 1862, when his forces were taken by surprise at the Battle of Shiloh. But Grant, a lot of people wanted me to fire Grant back then, but Grant had kept his head. He made his mistakes, but he kept his head, rallied his troops, and beat the Confederates off the field the very next day. He then conducted a brilliant campaign of siege to take the great Confederate fortress at Vicksburg. About that time we brought him, he helped also at Chattanooga, then we brought him back east where he became commander of all Union armies. He made his headquarters at the Army of the Potomac and urged on that army over the last few months of the war. Now, a lot's been said about Grant so-called being a butcher. The casualties were heavy on both sides. But while other generals did not have that same reputation, what was the difference between them and Grant? Grant beat General Lee, and he closed that war out within a year. We could have had other generals who were not called butchers, and this war could have gone on indefinitely. I do not accept that term for General Grant, but he knew what he had to do, and he did it quickly. And I think we should think about the many lives that were saved by bringing this war to a speedy end. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, General Lee and the other associated armies surrendered, but were there still militia groups and such like that were still?
Well, at this moment, General Johnston still has an army in the field, and there are various other Confederate contingents out. But once General Lee has surrendered, which he did on Sunday, and General Johnston, it's really just a matter of time. I expect any hour to get a telegram saying he has surrendered. I think Southern forces will see that what few there are left will see that there is no hope for continuing the struggle. I suppose they could get off in the forests and bushwhack people for an indefinite time, but I've always held that this has only been one country with a rebellion on its hands. We're all Americans, and I think they will realize too that this is a futile endeavor against their fellow citizens. I don't expect the fight to continue once General Johnston has surrendered. Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. President, could you comment on the 54th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry?
Was that under Colonel, you'll have to forgive me, this is the Negro Regiment that fought in North Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, they fought very bravely. I must admit, even I was at first reluctant to have Negro regiments. I feared that if they were beaten, that this would prove a terrible detriment upon the whole society of former slaves. Then I began to realize, I looked upon them finally with great confidence, great pride. They could fight as well as anyone. And a great loss of life. It was a hopeless charge those men made down the beach in North Carolina. Took tremendous casualties. They did not turn back until, long after there was any hope of winning that particular engagement. They fought with great bravery. Lost not only the colonel of the regiment, but most of the officers and a great percentage of the men involved. It's a terrible way to prove that they're men as well as any others, but they did it. I think this is what you're referring to, yes? Yes, sir.
Mr. President, I'm Larry from the Northwest Times.
Northwest of what? There's the old Northwest.
That's the fun part.
Northwest Oregon.
Of the many dreadful battles that you've endured, is there one in particular that stands out as the most troubling to your recollection?
Oh, well, I think of the casualties at times, the victories are nearly as hard to bear as the defeats. But maybe the lowest point for me was the Second Battle of Bull Run. I put John Pope in charge of much of McClellan's army, made his own army, gave him much of McClellan's. Not Pope. He liked to make like he was a great man of action. He said he issued all of his orders from headquarters in the saddle. And I wasn't quite sure if he really understood the distinction between his headquarters and his hindquarters. But that's what he said he would do. But he proved to be incompetent on the field. And this was after the disaster of the 7 Days battle. And that was a terrible low point. A terrible low point. Thinking of the Northwest, if you're from Oregon, I trust the people back there have forgiven me. As you may know, I was given the chance to become territorial governor back there in the 1840s, and I turned it down. Hoping no more hard feelings about that. There are various reasons for that, but most of all, perhaps, if anybody thinks that Mary Lincoln is going to cross the prairies in a covered wagon, well, they've got another thing coming. Yes, young friend.
How greatly decorated did you want Grant to be after he won against General?
Well, we did reestablish the office of a three-star general, which had not been held since Washington's time. General Grant, he wasn't very interested in decorations, and I knew that, and I didn't want to embarrass him by giving him some because he wouldn't have liked it. He goes around his headquarters in really a private's coat with his insignias of rank sewn onto the shoulders. He thinks that's a more comfortable coat than a fancy officer's coat, and he doesn't much hold with ceremony or bits of ribbon hanging off of him. This is not to denigrate those who do. I don't mean to do that at all, but General Grant is not very interested in decorations, and we kind of have an agreement. He'll keep fighting, and I'll hold back on the decorations. There was another question I saw. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, what was your predecessor, James Buchanan's attitude towards slavery? Was he pro or was he opposed and just...
Well, there's a group called the Mugwumps, where it's said because they sitting on the fence with their mugs on one side and their wumps on the other. and nobody who has not sat behind the president's desk can understand the pressure of this office, but President Buchanan, I think, did everything he could to avoid making any decision, one way or t'other. It was a pretty disastrous situation I stepped into. Fort Sumter was already under siege. It was a mess. I'm sure that President Buchanan wanted things to go better, but he didn't undertake the actions he needed to keep them better. But he's back home now, he's retired, and as I say, if you haven't sat behind that president's desk, you've got to be pretty reluctant to criticize him too harshly, because nobody knows the pressures over him. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Could you list out the pros and cons about the war?
Well, there aren't many pros to war. Did not want to do this during the campaign. I didn't campaign. I stayed at home, as we do. But I said I would see that federal forces would not fire the first shot. But at the same time, I had a solemn oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That means you run the machine as it is. The Constitution is a type of contract we've all signed on to, and you can't break that contract without the permission of the others unless you want to pay a heavy penalty. And both sides have paid a very, very heavy penalty. I'd have done almost anything to avoid this war, but I couldn't dishonor the pledge I had made to preserve the Union. There aren't many pros to war, but sometimes the con is simply that there is something worse than fighting. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. President, in these difficult years, where do you find solace to keep going?
Well, in the courage of our troops. If they didn't give up, how could I? I've been reading the Bible more than I used to. My wife and my remaining sons, Robert is up at Harvard. Well, actually, he's with General Grant's staff now, but he's been up at Harvard till the last few weeks. And Tad, try to get consolation in that. You try to take consolation in doing the right thing, but it's hard sometimes to know if you've really done the right thing or not. I try my best. Just one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, what position did the British and the French and maybe the Spanish take? Were the British looking at this as an opportunity to pull the Republic apart?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair summation. At least certain parties in Britain, and in France too. Now, France has generally been a friend, but Britain, I think, may have delighted in seeing the separation of our country, the destruction of the Union, but also both France and Britain, a great textile manufacturing, they wanted southern cotton. And so they tended, just for their own pure self-interest, to support the Confederacy to some extent. And there was talk they would recognize the Confederacy, and then there was talk they wouldn't. And the many providences that turn a war, there were bumper crops of cotton in Egypt, which meant that the French and the English could go to Egypt and get all the cotton they wanted. They didn't really need southern cotton at that point. And also, once the Declaration of, or rather the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, they knew this became a war over slavery. And once it was a war over slavery, they wanted nothing to do with it. One more here, then to Your Honor. Maybe we'll finish up with you. Yes, sir.
I just want to make a statement. I was born in February, as I think you were,
Huh.
and,
Our poor mothers, that's a cold month.
yeah, I was born in South Dakota, which is always cold. And I can't forget the other part of that question, but you've always been one of my heroes, and I wish I could say that to your face.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Many people have said many things straight to my face, but that was one of the more positive ones. Thank you very much. Your Honor.
Mr. President.
Last question.
Our neighbors to the south, Mexico, are currently engaged in a conflict in which France has installed a government in Mexico. What are your plans in regards to the influence of European powers into the North American continent?
Well, I have no immediate plans. As you know well, perhaps, Secretary Seward, when the French started making noises that they might topple the Mexican government, put in one of their own, he thought we should get into a war immediately with Mexico, and that the southern states would join with us, and that's how we would come back together. And I said, one war at a time, Mr. Secretary. I wasn't at all confident that that's how that would have ended up. I think what we're seeing in Mexico right now is absolutely contradictory to the Monroe Doctrine, which is not only held by the United States, but the other states in this hemisphere. They're having some problems, the French are, and they'll have more. We've been able to pledge support to the current Mexican government, the current president, even though he's somewhat in exile in northern Mexico. And if we have to, we'll perhaps give some aid to the Mexican government. But I think the French are beginning to think that it's a lot easier to get into a war than it is to get out of one. And I think they're already looking for the door there. And that'll be a very great achievement when the Mexicans can take back power under their own say-so. Well, there's a lot of work I've got to do before I can take that last train ride home. My duties call me elsewhere. Goodbye.